In our default HTML page, to create a dashboard, I added a select with the salespeople's names and IDs from the database. In my SQL Server database up in Azure, there is a salesperson called Stephen Buchanan, and in the employee ID table, he has a value of 8. I'm using the order analysis table, which we used in the stored procedure and parameters video, so it's the same content. The idea here is we are faking a login. So if you can imagine that Nancy DeValio logged into your application and she's only allowed to see the data for her sales or her orders. She can't see everyone's sales and everyone's orders. All I did here was add an event listener, and I'm picking up the selected index value of that select, and I'm passing that to an array called headers. So those headers array, I want to pass back to my reveal server so it can then use this selected index.value in a stored procedure. So what we have is an additional ig.reveal SDK settings called set additional headers provider. And the headers provider takes the URL that was passed here in our set base URL, which is our local host. So this would be your endpoint for your application. And then it will take the array of headers. In this case, I have a single header. You can pass as many as you'd like, and we're going to pass this back to the server. So we just say return headers, and that's it. What this is doing is it's taking my select, creating an array, and then using set additional headers provider, passing that back to the reveal server. What is the reveal server doing with that? So let's switch over to the reveal server, and we're going to add another class file here. And we're going to use the UserContext provider. So let's just add a class called UserContextProvider.cs. And the UserContext provider implements the IRV UserContext provider. And we'll go ahead and implement the interface for this. And of course, we are pulling in the HTTP context. So if you happen to be using the HTTP context, that's fine. Let's create a new variable called user identity name, and that's going to equal ASP.NetContext.user.identity.name. And if that's all you're using in the application, that's fine. You can just return the user identity name at this point. But what we're going to do is we want to pull in the headers that were passed from reveal. So I want to change this from my user identity name to the ASP.NetContext.request.headers. And then which headers do we want to get? We want to get xheader1, which is sent from the client. Since I can also pass an array of headers, if you are sending, like, for example, a user ID, a company ID, an office ID, etc., we can do a new dictionary object. And in this example, we'll just pretend we're passing in something like company ID with the variable of Elfkey, which is one of the companies in the customers table in Northwind. Then you could go ahead and use those properties as variables in additional stored procedure parameters or in custom queries. But in this case, I really just care about this. So now I'm just going to return a new instance of the RV user context, and I will pass in the user identity name and the property. So at this point, I've pulled in whatever was selected in the client, and it's now in an object called the user context that I can use in my application. Every time you attempt to access data in Reveal, it is going to go through this function, check the user context, populate any variables that you might be using in here, and then you can use those in other parts of the application. So let's go to our data source provider. And here where we hard-coded this 3 value earlier, you'll note that this change data source item async is also taking a user context variable of the IRV user context type. So I am going to change this to user context dot user ID. And that's really all we need to do to effectively pass this parameter to SQL Server. Keep in mind, our stored procedure is expecting an int, while SQL will typecast automatically if it can. We will just be safe and we'll do an int.parse, and we'll make sure that we're passing the correct numeric type. Now, while I am using a stored procedure here to pass my parameter to, just as easily, I could say SQL DSI.custom query equals and then pass a custom query. So instead of using the stored procedure, I could say select star from order analysis where employee ID equals, and then just do the same thing, plus UserContext.user ID, and it will achieve the same results as long as we have things spelled correctly. So I wouldn't do this in that case. I would do a custom query. My point is that once you have that user context and all of the additional information that you might be passing through the set additional headers provider, you can implement any type of row level security options, either through a stored procedure or a custom query. In this case, we are going to use the stored procedure. So let's just go ahead and uncomment this, and we're ready to go. But before we run this, there's one last thing we need to do. In program.cs, we had to register our authentication provider and our data source provider. We need to do the same for our user context provider. So let's go ahead and do a .add user context provider, and IntelliSense takes care of all the hard work for us. And now we are really done. So let's go ahead and save all of our classes. We'll hit run. As that starts up, let's jump over to our client. And again, on the client, we are going to pass the value coming in to a headers array. That headers array, we're going to pass a variable called xheader1 based on that selected index.value. And that's what we're going to use as the parameter to our stored procedure. So let's right click, open this up in our default browser. Let's go ahead and open our developer tools as well. And as I select items, I did have a console.log. So there is Nancy DeValio is number 1. Janet Lieberling is 3. Michael Sayuma is 6. So let's go ahead, add visualization, order by detail. And I'm going to change this to a grid. And let's go ahead and grab the last name. And we will see Suyama, just like we had from our selection, etc. Now let's close this. Let's go select another individual. Now keep in mind, this is our fake login. So in your application, this would be your context that the user logs in with that you're passing to Reveal to do that row level security, which is really what this is all about. So let's add a new visualization here, and I'll change this to a grid again. And let's grab the last name, and you can see that it is Dodsworth and everything matches up. So there you have it, with a few steps in the client to pass the header information to the server used in the user context function in Reveal. We can pass parameters to the data source items and enable row level security in our dashboards.